I would like to welcome our two other distinguished panelists to the stage. Yves Daccord is the Director General of the International Committee of the Red Cross. ICRC is probably one of the world's preeminent organizations engaged in difficult environments. Thomas Gass is the United Nations Assistant General Secretary for Policy Coordination and one of the leading speakers on the evolution, the post-2015 agenda, and findings for development. Just one notice, you'll notice this is a number of white men here, and I am acutely aware of that. I think it's even more difficult that all of us have some ties with Switzerland. So this is not some other scheme here. Amina Mohammed at the last minute was unable to make it because there are negotiations happening in New York. And we, despite our NGO sensibilities of let's make sure all these things are diverse, wanted to focus on having people who knew what they're talking about, who he came rapidly, and we're very grateful that Thomas Gass, on the last minute, was able to join us. So I'll welcome our panel.
So we're gonna talk about the future we're sitting in. We've heard some interesting academic perspectives. Both of you are involved in a more tangible way in the world and in changing and adapting the world. But I thought it might be interesting to look, and there's all talk of looking out 15 years. What are some of the mega trends that you see on the horizon from where you sit? And I thought maybe, Yves, start with you as an organization that is in some of the more fragile spaces in the world. As you look at nation states, as you look at Middle East region, other regions, what are the forces that ICRC is grappling with as you look a bit over the horizon?
Thank you, Sam, and good morning to all of you. What I would provide in a debate is really one perspective, and take it as one perspective, which is a perspective of an organization, the International Committee of the Red Cross, working in war, in violent situation, with people on the ground, really, on the ground, not just in Damascus, but in Aleppo, not just in Kabul, in Herat, I mean, really places where it's difficult. Maybe the first trend, I don't know how you feel about it, but again, listening to Bill, that strikes me is, over the next 5 to 10 years, I think we will continue to be overwhelmed what's happened in the world. And possibly, I feel at least, that the concept we have to try to understand the reality will be less and less relevant. And that will be very challenging for us, for all of us, right? Trying to understand what's happening to us. And maybe one of the trends is not bringing action plan or solutions, but be more open about asking ourselves the right question. And it's very challenging for all of us, including, by the way, humanitarian and development actors. We do have assumptions. We work based on assumptions. We try to do that, and maybe possibly we will have to recognize that some of our assumptions are not anymore relevant, and we might come back on that one. I think the second trend is I see that we are more and more confronted with global issues, migration, climate change, economic crisis, violence, conflict, on one hand. What I mean global is beyond country, beyond region. And on the other hand, I don't see right now, over the next 5 to 10 years, any international convergence at the political level which we somewhat be able to deal with these critical issues. What we see in every country, in every region where we work, what we see is states at the national level, but also at the global level, their strategy right now is about containment. So what you see is the strategy is containment. Containment of migration, containment of epidemic, containment of war. And the problem is, we know, and that's what we feel on every day, that the situation in which we operate will last. I can tell you, Syria, and I hope I'm wrong, but the Syrian war will last for the next 5 years, at least. I cannot predict more than 5 years, and even there I'm not sure, but 5 years, yes. Yemen, Libya, watch carefully the Sahel, look at Nigeria, look at South Sudan, Look at Somalia. Look at Afghanistan. Afghanistan is back to our agenda very soon, and we know it will last. And the problem is, it seems for me that there is a disconnect between, in fact, global issues and somewhat the international community being able to really deal with global issues, having possibly the country and the international dimensions just focusing and agree on just containment and security. And that's where I feel is a huge trend. I mean, my last trend is it's about people. We are dealing with people who are constantly put under multiple pressure. If you're in South Sudan, when is the emergency starting and when is it finishing? If you're in Palestine, you know, when is it starting? When is it finishing? We are there for decades, and that's what worries me. And it means that people having to deal with acute crises at the same time chronic issues. And this is so cold for all of us if we are thinking, including for us humanitarian, that our dividing, you know, i.e. that there is development here, there's humanitarian, that there's even a continuum. We really have to challenge that very seriously. All of us. Not so much in terms of concept, but all of us in terms of how we work. Otherwise, people affected, people victim, will challenge us much more. And maybe that leads me to my fourth and last challenge and global trend. I think people affected will challenge us more. We are a world which is very global, very connected, but also very fragmented. I don't know how it is for you, but we hear more and more, and we see that people, you know, talking to us, comparing what we can offer. I have one nice anecdote which happened a year ago in Somalia. Somalia is still today possibly one of the most difficult places to work, including for my organization. And 2 days before the typhoon in Philippines, one of the biggest typhoon, a different typhoon hit Somalia. Very different. It took 4 days to my team to move from Mogadishu to the places affected by this typhoon. 4 days. Why 4 days? Because we had to negotiate every mile with, in fact, warlord groups, you know, being able to negotiate, because you don't impose humanitarian action. You have to negotiate with them. After 4 days, my team arrived, and they are received by a community affected. And frankly, to be honest with you, 4 days in Somalia, being able to do that, to develop that, is something which is tough, but you're proud to arrive. And then they are received, and the leader of the community, she's a woman. She looked at the team, and she's very cold, and says, "You are late." You are late in Somalia, 4 days. And she looks at her phone, and says, "We checked, you know, it took you 1 day to provide services in Philippines. 4 days in us. And by the way, what are you providing? Your hospital is very small. The one you provided in the Philippines is much bigger. Why? You don't like us?" And this is the world in which we operate much more. Even in the remotest area, even in the most difficult, people are more and more comparing, exploring, judging. And we need to start to grasp that. Because what will happen as a trend is people will be more demanding. They will more and more challenge us, all of us. And we feel it, but even in the most remote area. And here, if we want to get access to these people, if we want to get acceptance, I think the relationship, the type of services, and the relevance of our services will be much more critical than today.
So thank you, Yves. And Thomas, you have this sort of broad vantage point from the UN involved in negotiations right now. Thank you very much for coming down in the midst of the financing for development negotiations. And if you did sort of a tour d'horizon looking out, I mean, this is for the first time nation states are coming together with a broader framework than the MDGs. You know, how is that coming together? To what extent does that reflect the world that we're going to have to wrestle with for the next 15 years?
Well, first, if you allow me, I just want to add 3 points to Yves.
Sorry about that.
And that is, I believe that there is that we are feeling our planetary boundaries in a way that we've never done before. I mean, you take water, for example, the shortage of water. I mean, we're just waiting for the next crisis where in an area where millions of people live, the water starts to be contaminated with manganese or some heavy metals because the water table is too low. And how do we deal with that? I mean, It would just be another proof of how we are hitting those planetary boundaries right now. A strong sense of inequality also. I mean, 10 years ago, the word inequality was NGOs, was maybe a couple of think tanks, etc. Today, it's interesting how it's part of the discussion of the politicians, etc., of the governments. And thirdly, I would say a shift of what governance is. And a shift from the nation state that controls, that negotiates, to a society where Belistally we might say, where finally the people are involved in a different way in the conversation, in the politics, but can also walk away. And this is what causes some of these big crises also with migrants. They are able to move from one place to another and share the burden in a maybe unwanted way, but they are basically sharing that burden. Now, what is happening in New York now is something really interesting, and I'm very glad that we had this talk about frameworks and about action frameworks, because I've been a development practitioner my whole life, and here we have a process where 193 countries come together, are supposed to develop the next strategic framework that's supposed to follow the MDGs, the Millennium Development Goals, and they come up with 17 goals and 169 targets. How can that be? How can someone who has log frames in his DNA wrap his mind around a framework of 169 targets? The truth is, when you bring so many countries together, and this is very important, when you open the door to civil society, and when you interview 7 million people, as was done also by the UN as part of this preparatory process, the result doesn't fit on half a piece of paper. It doesn't work like that. So you ask me, what do we have now? We had Millennium Development Goals. It was neat. It was quite clear. It was a log frame, I would say, for the relationship nearly between the donors and the recipient countries. Now what we have is more of a shared vision of humanity. I would say it doesn't maybe have human rights all over it, because after all, it's governments that have negotiated them, and they are very wary of this instrument being used against them afterwards in conditionalities. But certainly, the Sustainable Development Goals, I just brought it here, so in case you find it on the internet, you see what it looks like. This is the draft document. This is an emerging document, an emerging set of goals. I believe it is more a shared vision of humanity. A set of boxes that we have to tick. It's not the same as the human rights, but mind you, the human rights were not developed by 193 countries, plus civil society and 7 million people interviewed. So 169 boxes that have to be ticked within the next 15 years. It doesn't give us that sense of focus, that sense of strategic focus, but it certainly can be a much better basis for a basis for a new social contract between governments and their people. And this is where this process can be really important. And I believe that's why I wanted to add the word governance to these mega trends, because I think people want to participate. They don't want a democratic model imposed on them. They want to participate, and there'll be different ways of doing that.
And I mean, we tend to talk about these things in terms of focusing on the global south, on other countries. I mean, these are ultimately universal challenges and goals. So if we apply them to ourselves in the north, to what extent do you think this has to mean a change in our own thinking?
Good question. Frankly, I'm struggling as a humanitarian organization with, in fact, the framework in which we operate right now. And what I found difficult, I like what you said, Thomas, about the fact that it might at least be a bit of a common language, possibly. The problem is governance is perceived something which is still owned by states, right? And in the world in which I'm living and operating, state control only part of the reality. And I'm here not only about the civil society only. I mean, how do you do development in an area where, in fact, the government controls only a limited part of the population of the territory, right? It seems for me that there is absolutely not recognition that we're living in a world where you have more than ever civil war, you have non-international armed conflict, as we call it, everywhere. How do you do development, humanitarian actions? How do you think, goals in a situation where we know in the next 10 years the Middle East will be with us completely, dramatically, tense with fighting, whatever. So I think what I'm still struggling is what does that mean for our society? And B, in our world, I think what I would find useful also is that we start to understand that these goals are not only for the people there, but also here. That people off the grid are not only down there. We're taking care in this country about the prisoner, for example. Right? I see around the world that prisoner is a population which has absolutely no support. What is happening? How do we manage that? How do we tackle that? And that's a bit of my worry in a way that, so when some of the goals are really perceived as something from the west to the south still today and read like that.
And, sort of you're approaching these, to me, I like this concept of a framework within which we operate, a sort of sense of direction. And, I still wrestle with, applying this to more fragile parts of the world. Where that are more threatened and marginalized. I mean, you sort of get to this concept that ultimately, half of the world's extremely poor are going to live or be living in these fragile environments. I'm curious to see how that, is this creating a discussion within the UN? Are states recognizing this as a challenge? Is there, maybe a focus on financing and development, on fragility and so forth? I'm curious to get your thoughts.
I mean, I believe that probably the biggest shift in paradigm in this new emerging agenda is the sense or this commitment to leave no one behind. This is quite different from what we did under the MDGs. Remember, the MDGs was about reducing poverty by half. We could have chosen which half. Actually, we did choose which half. We chose those areas that would have maximum leverage, those areas those low-hanging fruit, and let's be honest, we were hiding behind averages, and we still are. And this is what's amazing, if you have goals that everybody should have access to water, and here's one for you, Yves. There's actually a target that says that by 2030 everyone should have a legal identity. I mean, this is huge. There is a focus on the most vulnerable, which normal politicians and normal technocrats would not take because it's very, very dangerous. And so when we now have a vision, a shared vision that compels us to go in that direction, what does it mean in development cooperation? And I think you'll agree that this is a useful shift if we are able to do it. I believe that we have to start our dialogue with the governments I'm part of an intergovernmental system, and so by identifying the most vulnerable, by understanding why they are vulnerable, by understanding what threats they are facing, whether they're economic, social, environmental, and political, and that we discuss with them, with the governments, what mitigation measures could be taken, how we could respond to these problems. This is quite a different way of approaching development cooperation in the future. If we really get it right, and I actually believe if we don't do it that way, we will not be able to achieve these goals and targets. The Secretary General actually, taking the cue, by the way, from civil society, said we should consider that if there is an economic or social group that has not achieved these goals and targets, that we then have not achieved them. So basically, that's the test.
And Thomas mentioned, Yves, that this concept of a world where we're facing sort of planetary boundaries and so forth, and yet what we're facing, particularly the most vulnerable, are shocks that force them their already very resilient lives and push them outside boundaries where they can survive. And to some extent, these shocks are accelerating. Mm-hmm. And we're responding to these shocks as best we can. Is there any way to, how do we get ahead of them? Or do you see a future where these shocks will, climatary need to migrate, inability to survive and live and have a livelihood in a certain nation or certain area, do you think these shocks are what our future will bring?
Sorry, because it's a bit of a grim...
It's a grim question.
No, and a grim perspective too. If I look in the world in which we operate, the sense is that you will have more population being under pressure and community find it difficult to manage, as you mentioned, some of the shock. But the point then to Thomas, I think what we should agree here collectively is not just about state and the way state are framing or not the reality. And I'm happy that there is a discussion, including about the most vulnerable and what it means. The key question will be still to me is who then finance what? That will be still the interesting questions about that. We'll see about that. But I think the point is also for us. I'm sitting with Sam, you have to know, in a collective which is called the Interagency Steering Committee, which brings the UN, the Red Cross, and NGOs together. And I must confess, over the last few years, our inability to really discuss the real issues, the fact that we are constantly talking about process, focus about coordination, but not really coordination, and not being able to move to collaboration, having a very, very huge difficulty to talk about reality, willing only to coordinate our ambition and not really our reality, what's happening on the ground, is striking. So I think it's also good to talk about government. It's good to really push it, and then we should influence, but I think it's also good that we start to look at us, the way we operate, the way we connect. I don't see development actors in Syria, in South Sudan. I don't see. Where are they? Where is the entry point? How do we work around that? I don't see a lot of humanitarian actors taking seriously the risks which are needed. I think we have a new balance of risk. I think the model, which has been the majority, the mainstream model of international humanitarian organization, which has been to outsource the response and the risk to other organizations, is something which needs to be challenged in the world of today and tomorrow. Why? Because I'm of the opinion that close proximity is possibly what we need. If we want to build response which makes sense, if we want to help community to be able to manage, in fact, shock, it's good to think about system, but it's also very good to be close to where it's happening, to understand the needs, the coping mechanism, and not just a one-off, to stay, in order also to be engaging the people who count. And here you cannot just talk about state. You have to be able to talk with the Taliban. You want to be serious about Afghanistan? You have to engage Taliban. So we have to move outside of a dogmatic perspective. You want to be serious about migration? You want to invest in Lebanon, rightly so? You have to think, if you want to invest in Lebanon, and you're not only humanitarian, but in terms of really system, then you have to sit down with Hezbollah. Why? Because they control 40% of the system. And I know it's totally dogmatic, but this is up to us, really, to have a different perspective, and it's a very challenging one. So it's also combining, on one hand, the ability to do advocacy, the ability to do global advocacy, to be able to do global humanitarian diplomacy, but also when we are real, to be real, to connect with what is happening about our gaps and being able to engage. So I think it's also slightly, if I would say over the next few years, rediscussing the balance of risk that we are ready to take, we as a collective. with all our differences. And maybe last but not least, also move out of a concept which I think has been an extremely negative concept, is the idea that we collectively represent a system. The famous humanitarian system. I think it's a very misleading concept. Why? Because the systems give me the impression there is a centers, there is rule, there is command and control. In the world of today, where do you want to have the center? We have to agree that there are several centers. We have to agree that command and control is not the right way to approach it. We have to agree that diversity, maybe diversity of action is different. And maybe what we have to agree is that we have been two types of situations. One type of situation is where the local government authorities are in a position to provide basic services to their population. In this case, it makes a lot of sense for me to reinforce and support this government with a check and balance. But there are more and more situations, Sam, where local authorities or national authorities are not in a position to provide basic services to their population because they cannot. Central African Republic, you can help them, but there is no infrastructure. They won't be in a position, and not in the next 5 to 10 years. Or because they are at war. Syria, Libya, South Sudan, Afghanistan. So, and in that kind of situation, maybe this is the moment where you have to have a really principled humanitarian action and bringing some of the development tools within the humanitarian perspective. And that will work very differently. And that would be the only way for me also to be realistic about what we talk and helping communities, which are very smart, to start to possibly, how can I say, manage shock. I don't see in the next 5 to 10 years how we will be ahead of the game. I think the best way to do that is to be close to the people, really, I'm serious about, and trying to support them from within, and not pushing too much in the ability to be ahead of the game.
And one of the real powerful things that's emerged in the development conversation in the past 15 years or so is the whole concept of country ownership, of societal ownership. And one of the amazing things of this 103 nations coming together is this sort of writing this world's manifesto of how we individual, universally own our own futures, and that has civil society involved in that mix. And yet, we're going to Addis, and it's financing, and for areas where people, Europe, U.S., North America, tend to looking to our own problems. To some extent, are we retreating into a nationalistic ownership or development, or do you think there is still this space for nations to support each other for a sort of grand bargain, not like the MDGs, but a different form of bargain that is going to shape this next 15 years?
I believe that definitely that bargain, that sense of, let's call it the sense of solidarity and a sense of humanity, but maybe in a even more philosophical way than the humanitarianism, which is part of that. The sense of belonging to the same, we the people, the first 3 words of the UN Charter. And interestingly, I heard a professor the other day say that this 2015 agenda has some characteristics of a charter in the way that it has been developed. I believe that there's a complementarity, of course. We will need national action and global action just as much as we will need humanitarian action and development cooperation. The other day I was invited to a very interesting seminar of the Council on Foreign Relations in New York, and at the end of my talk about the post-2015 agenda and the Sustainable Development Goals, someone in the back of the room said, yeah, but if that's the way it will go, will the development side of the UN not trump the peace and security side? And will that not eclipse the peace and security work that the UN does? And I kind of maybe instinctively I responded, well, finally, I believe that here we have a chance to go to the root causes of some of the problems. of course, Band-Aids will be needed, and the Band-Aids, as we've heard, are not easy ones. They're really, really complicated issues. But we have a chance, and we have an obligation to address the root causes, build resilience. I served 4 years in Nepal, just the 4 years before the earthquake. It's a very interesting case. Most people don't talk about this right now because we're still reeling from all from the shock of that earthquake. But we knew that earthquake was coming. In 2010, we had the earthquake in Port-au-Prince in Haiti, and all of us who were in Kathmandu, we knew the next one is Kathmandu. We knew it. We talked about it all the time. Well, it was interesting how the international community, particularly led by the resident coordinator there, Robert Piper and others, really systematically built the preparedness, this resilience. And I believe that the result would have been far worse had that not happened. And so we have to do that. But we cannot do that if we are in our silos and the humanitarians are there and say, oh, we are dealing with the really difficult countries. Those of us who are in the development cooperation community, we take the easy ones, in inverted commas. Then it doesn't work. Because we need the knowledge, we need the experience of the humanitarian community to help build resilience and to help address the most vulnerable. Because we don't always see that. We have like a blindness to the reality of issues that are intractable and difficult. So I really hope that this new agenda will help bring together the different parts of the development community, the humanitarians, the civil society, the governments, the local communities, but also find a much better integration between addressing crisis and building resilience, keeping the most vulnerable in the center of the focus.
Can I just say something on what Thomas said? I don't know how you feel about that, but my sense is over the next coming years, that life for all of us will be tougher. So it's not only because we want to connect with development, the humanitarian actors. I think there will be one question which was resource constraint. We're moving in a world, we feel it already, there will be less money for development and possibly less money also for humanitarian. Clearly, there will be a huge push from the Western world to try to somewhat share the burden with other emerging country or emerged country. I think it will be difficult, at least for a while. I think at home there was a huge pressure not to spend too much money internationally, and I think the money will go into security. Very clear. We know that already. So I think the question for us, all of us here, will be how then do we connect each other? I think if we continue to have a vision with a kind of a vision of this is humanitarian, this is development, I think we will be confronted with almost an obligation to find different way and to approach it differently and guide us through possibly different concepts. Otherwise, I think the pressure on all of us, if I just look at that side, will be much bigger than we hope. And happy to join you in 2 or 3 years to see if it's true. I hope I'm wrong, but I think the pressure will be much serious in terms of resource constraint, collaboration, finding ways. And if we don't find the ways, I think it will be very difficult.
So let's bring in another dimension on this, because I mean, one of the things about the sustainability goals is this is also about the environment, it's about climate, it's about our ability as humanity to adapt to a changing climate and perhaps have an agreement around that. And if you put another overlay on this conversation that we've been talking about, development, humanitarian, and so forth, a common sense focused on this, how does an environmental frame change your thinking, or does it?
I would say this whole frame has to completely change. It's not an environmental. Sustainable development is being redefined as we speak. I mean, all of a sudden there's good governance, legal identity, the most vulnerable are there, the commitment to leave no one behind. When was that part of the definition of sustainable development? If you allow me, there was just a couple of months ago, The Economist said the sustainable development goals are stupid. And you know why they said it? They said it because it would take at least 4% of global GDP or 15% of savings, global savings, to implement them. The problem is, this is not about 4%. This is about 100%. And if you take climate change as an example, how can you even think that with leveraging 4% of the global economy, you would get climate change under control? It's impossible. And there are 16 other very difficult goals there. So this is all about bringing everybody on deck and getting everyone involved, the private sector as well, making sure that financial flows have a positive effect in terms of these 169 targets. And the only one who can do that are the people themselves. It's not something that can be imposed by the international community. Now, somebody will say, well, how do you expect a normal person to remember 169 targets? The important thing is that when a president of a country comes to New York in September to this big summit, probably one of the biggest we've ever had, that the people back home know that he's going there to make a promise to him or her, that health post in the village is finally going to come, that road that is going to link that they've been asking for all the time, that's going to link them to the market, is going to come, that finally they will be allowed to elect their local officials, that they can get an ID card so that they can travel. These promises, what is important is that when our heads of government and heads of state come to New York in September, it's not about the photo op. Of course, the handshake is important and the fact that we are part of a global community, but really important is that the people back home feel that this shared vision is for them, and this is something that we need everyone to help us communicate. And there's already a big mobilization in the world to make sure that this news goes around.